Welcome to today's Natural Areas Association webinar. For those of you who are joining us, we're happy that you're able to join us. Please try out the chat function. Tell us where you're joining us from. We're going to be using the chat to collect your questions during the presentation. We'll also be sharing links to open access publications that come up in the presentation slides. And then we have some audience interaction that we'll invite you to participate in. So we're going to go ahead and get started here. My name's Sarah Piers. I work in programming with the Natural Areas Association, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar. We are a member-supported nonprofit organization. We are a national organization, and we support your work in a multitude of ways. We publish a quarterly peer-reviewed publication called the Natural Areas Journal, where we publish research and practice. We also host in-person regional workshops that we invite you to check out. We host the annual Natural Areas Conference, and we also regularly host webinars like this one. We are a 501c3 nonprofit, and we're over 40 years old. I encourage you to check out our website, naturalareas.org, connect with a colleague who's a member of ours to learn more about what we do to support your work. I'll hand it over to our executive director, Lisa Smith. Go ahead, Lisa.
Hi, everyone. I'd also like to welcome you to our webinar today. Our guest, Paul Rogers, will be presenting information today that lays the groundwork for an interactive symposium on aspen conservation that will be part of our virtual Natural Areas Conference coming up this October. We're working hard to get information on our website and registration open, so check back to our website at naturalareas.org soon to take a look at the great program we have lined up for you and register. We're fortunate at NAA to be able to work with partners like Paul and others to make webinars like this one today free of charge to you. But not all of them are underwritten, and so we'd like to encourage those of you who find this type of programming of value to become members of NAA. It's one of the ways that you can support us so that we're able to continue to offer this type of valuable resource for you. Times are changing, as all of us are experiencing, and while we are committed to continue to offer important information and support to our community, we're faced with the challenge of funding this work. I think you'll see in the near future that a membership in NAA, however, will bring with it even more benefit for those of you working in natural areas conservation. And thanks to those of you who are members, we look forward to continuing to serve you in many ways. And with that, I'm pleased to welcome today's speaker. Paul Rogers is the director of the Western Aspen Alliance, an adjunct associate professor in the Department of Wildland Resources, and a Utah State University Ecology Center associate. Dr. Rogers is currently working on issues related to disturbance ecology and wildlife impacts and benefits to aspen ecosystems. He's published more than 50 professional and technical papers and appeared in media, print, video, and online content more than 100 times. We're thrilled to host Dr. Rogers' presentation today. And with that, Paul, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Lisa. That was a very nice introduction. I appreciate that. One slight correction or addendum is that my host department has changed. However, I don't mind acknowledging both the Wildland Resources and the Department of Environment and Society. So, and that's all part of the College of Natural Resources here at Utah State University. So I think you'll see my opening slide up there, and we're ready to go there. As Lisa mentioned, I run an organization called the Western Aspen Alliance. I should say I share running that with a virtual crowd of over 600 members. I'll get to that near the end of the show, but basically we're a nonprofit as well, and what we do is share information and get technology into the hands of field practitioners as well as other scientists. So I'm a scientist myself. You'll see that throughout this presentation. I publish quite a bit, but my main job here is facilitating getting information out to folks on the ground, making new science palatable, digestible to those who need it on the ground. And as you'll see here, some would describe aspen ecology as a narrow niche, but you'll find that it's anything but as you go through this show, both disciplinary and geographically, we're going to go a very long way today. So I've got to get going on that, and I'm going to jump right in. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge I've got a lot of help from photographers, and that's one of the things that I do. Everything I do, I try to do it a two-way street. So I dispense information. I have other experts help me, but I also have people send me things. And we occasionally have little fun photo contests and other types of contests, which you'll hear about in just a second. But this gentleman, Lance Oded, has been a real asset to the Western Aspen Alliance as a volunteer photographer. So you'll see his nice work throughout this show. So here's where I'm headed. Again, a lot of ground to cover. So I'm going to just talk about loosely, broadly connections and how that fits into Aspen, but also how that fits into how we do our work, how we've done it well and how we've done it not so well in the past. Also the value added components of Aspen ecosystems. Some of you may not be aware. I have to admit this has quite a Western US bias, but there are some there are a little bit of tidbits from other places on the continent as well as around the world. And then this idea that the sum of the parts are greater than the whole, and you'll see that quite evidently here. The What's New populists take off on that old song, What's New Pussycat, but that's the new science part. And that's where I'm going to challenge folks that are shrugging their shoulders and say, I know it all, we've known it all. Matter of fact, the U.S. Forest infamously said that about 5 minutes before they cut the Aspen research program back in the 1980s. We know all there is to know about Aspen. I'm going to talk about this adaptive cycle, and that's where the rubber meets the road. That's the field practitioner side of things, how we infuse monitoring into our work and make that informative and also flexible. And then finally, back to this, it's really connections theme, beginning and end and bookends, but the sharing is caring. So some kind of cliche headings there, but you'll see what I mean in a minute. So just sort of take a pause here. These are obviously very weird times. Strange things happen. These are tenuous times or even scary times for some people. Look at us, we're all holed up in our offices or our homes or looking at a technical presentation from far, far away. But what I want to emphasize is sort of the opposite, the linkages, and not just ecological linkages, but linkages between us. These connections that we're missing, the ones that are underground. I'll bring up this symbology of a connected root system, which is integral to understanding Aspen ecology. But the connections between humans and nature are critical. These synergies are so important. And sometimes we lose sight of them in our day-to-day dealings, not only with the environment, but with each other as professionals. So my whole approach and the approach of the Western Aspen Alliance is to freely share knowledge. And that's what we're doing here today. And we have a number of modes in which we do that. So expanding the root network, if you will, looking at social linkages, professional connections, having reverence for diversity, and obviously the aesthetic, the flickering golden community that I so love, Aspen Ecology. So with that in mind, you probably see something here you didn't know, some ecological connection that you're unaware of here. This dog here taking down, no, I'm just kidding. Somebody had a very obedient dog that posed next to a tree that was impacted by beaver. But I'm imploring you in a funny way to look for those hidden connections, the ones that we've missed, that we've overlooked. And then, of course, the social community connections, this sort of fisheye look with the Aspen overarching this community, in this case, an annual event we hold in Wyoming called Aspen Days. And practitioners from a whole variety of state, federal agencies, private landowners, and so on, who come out to freely learn in an interactive way, to exchange information, ask questions, to share recent studies, and so on. So those connections are critical to what we do, and I think we lose sight of them. And this is, even though this is a difficult and strange time, there are many ways we can connect, and we just got to keep the channels open. So with that in mind, this is the show within the show, and I'm going to sort of invite you all to play along with our game show here that will extend a few days out after this. We know that truth is stranger than fiction, so occasionally the Western Aspen Alliance via the Facebook page holds a little fun contest called Flash Fiction, and now you're all invited to play. So what are the rules? Basically, you need to write a story. Could be a haiku, could be poetry in 3 statements, 3 lines, 3 sentences. I'll have 3 photos that are not so hidden within this show, and they'll be demarcated by me saying nothing for 30 seconds while you look at that photo. We're going to kind of cover the odd, the mystical, and then sort of a rough breakup, sort of the human side of things, all tangible to Aspen Systems. And I would just kind of keep it fun. So if there's a pause in the action and I'm not saying anything and there's an interesting picture on the screen, jot down some ideas and play along. With that in mind, back to our primary show, I want to talk about the value-added component. Many of those in the Western Aspen Alliance and who work in the Western U.S. are very aware of these, but I need to kind of start from a common base. So we have values to people, and there's a lot of them. I've made a short list here: livestock, hunting, water retention and conservation, fish habitat, fire protection, on and on. Some odd ones or maybe indirect ones that folks are not aware of is that real estate in and around ski resorts. I would challenge you to find almost any Western ski resort that doesn't feature aspen in their photography. And we actually know that that ski resorts in general don't make their money off of selling ski passes. They actually make money off of the adjacent real estate that goes on there at the bottom of the hill, which is on private land, and the hill is often on federal land. And then this idea of intrinsic values, we make these statements all the time, but I'd like you to sort of, try to think about what we're doing in our professions and what are the things that we put a price tag on, and what are the things that are tangible and what are those that are not tangible, but perhaps of greatest value to us. I don't think we should ever lose sight of these things, images such as this, visiting places, having those encounters with friends and family and even strangers in places that evoke sort of some peace within us, perhaps some just sheer joy. Similarly, there are some ecological values. This hole in the center is actually very historic. This is the very first den that wolves were reintroduced into Yellowstone in 1995. A couple of my colleagues in the upper part of the picture there, and we visited there, oddly enough, on the, I can't remember the date, a couple of years ago when we had a full solar eclipse. Now, we were in the 98% zone, but it was quite an amazing day for us. But this is the first wolf den, and in the far back right, we see a couple of aspen trees. But the intricacies and the interactions of wolves and herbivores and aspen, sort of a well-known story, although somewhat disputed in the scientific community. But again, let's focus in on some of those things that we're not always quite aware what they mean. Biodiversity. If we just take one chunk of the western landscape here in western Wyoming, not too far from where I'm sitting, one district wildlife biologist sort of documenting all the species that are dependent on aspen systems. And this is very much a short list. And I think this individual favored bird species. But nonetheless, these are animals that are visiting and using these systems on a daily basis. And there's a lot. And this would be dwarfed by the number of plants that favor and even are dependent on aspen ecosystems. This habitat idea, this support, this structural idea of a keystone species is sometimes confused and or overlaps with the idea of a foundation species. I won't get into that debate right now, but I wanted to make sure we understood and we're on the same page with what a keystone species is. Basically, one species or system, and I'm going to talk about keystone systems, and I'm going to distinguish very clearly today between some interest or favoritism or bias or even lust for an individual species, aspen, versus this entire system. Obviously, the keystone in that photo in the upper left is a key not only to that arch, but to the structure of the entire building. And that's symbolic of what aspen are in the West, being the only hardwood, and much of Canada as well in some systems, among a sea of conifers. I'm not talking about Keystone Light. So I'm going to jump way out to this recent paper that was part of the advertising for this and talk about if we project these keystone systems across the world, we have an immense amount of biodiversity supported by aspen ecosystems worldwide. And I'm going to talk about at the end of this presentation sort of an alternative look at our traditional conservation approach. But the idea with this was to bring scientists together across borders, across agencies, across institutions, and talk about for the first time how this biodiversity aspect of aspen is important and how it's being threatened around the world through mismanagement, through other human uses, by climate change and so on, and what we might do to have a really huge impact on biodiversity worldwide. So the idea of the sum of the parts here is that in a systems thinking, perhaps a little older, systems thinking and acting, the sum of the parts are greater than the whole. So individual species amount to something that's greater than, for example, an aspen forest, because there's so much going on there and there's so much connection to the adjacent lands, those grasslands and conifer forests in the background here. Here with a workshop several years ago with a fun group I work with out of Los Angeles called Pando Populus. And by the way, this is the famed Pando aspen clone in central Utah, thought to be the largest living organism on Earth, of 106 acres, all one living being. But we're looking at root systems here. We did a quick exercise where we dug up 1 square meter. In the lower center, I don't know if you can see my arrow here, pointing, there's a vegetative reproduction, a little sprout coming directly off a root. What we did is dig up this, took all the roots in, laid them out on a table, measured them all, and then projected that across the grove. And it came out to something like 22,000 kilometers, about half the distance around the world was our estimate of and this is only the shallow root system, by the way, of the Pando clone. So those connections, those reaches are not only symbolic, but they're physical underground. And it's also symbolic of there's a lot going on in the ground that we know little about that's so important to this ecology. So these are, this tree facilitates rich and intricate interactive systems. And so we're talking about system conservation, not species. Let's step back in time. And actually, this is not back in time some places in the world. In the Black Hills in 1965, this is how we treated aspen. This was a, in quotes, weed species to be eliminated and to make way for faster growing timber species. Interestingly enough, in a workshop there last year, I actually heard out of the mouths of participants that this is completely reversed. The weed species was the predominant conifer, which I won't name by name. I hate to get into hate speech, even if it's species oriented. But aspen is so valued now for its contribution to plant and animal diversity in that area, being a sort of a minority species, but its value for habitat is huge. But in Russia, in China, in some other places in the world, aspen is still being plowed up for almost the exact same reason. It's in our way, it's a weed species, and it detracts from us growing faster growing species. So how do I sum up aspen ecology in my own phrase? Aspen's a beautiful thin-skinned fire-loving clone. And I love my clause here, except when it isn't. And what I'm going to do here is go through some of that conventional aspen ecology and then show you the exceptions, which there are many. So the thin skin part, this is a part that's really important to understanding aspen. And what I mean by that is a thin bark. Aspen is easily affected by a large variety of disease as well as insects. The bark is easily penetrated. Fungi are planted within the tree, but that creates great habitat for species such as this bird here. This is a dead tree, but in live trees, there's excellent cavity nesting habitat. And then, of course, you have this chain of secondary and tertiary cavity nesters. The thin skin also makes aspen susceptible to sun scald, and it can actually be a introductory vector for other diseases. It kind of kills the skin, kills the cells in the skin if there's too much sun on it, not enough shade. But fire is very interesting, and there are many ramifications here. What I want to talk about, though, primarily in terms of thin skin, is that a little bit of fire on aspen, relatively small amount. Think of a flame creeping across a forest floor that's a 0.5 meter high. can be, in quotes, a stand replacing fire. Because the skin is so thin, all of those trees could be killed with a hot understory burn. And so that's very different than how we think about forest and even fire ecology. So that thin skin plays an important role. So what about this fire loving? Aspen loves fire, it reproduces by fire, it needs fire. And in this picture, we see this fire mosaic here. By the way, this was a prescribed burn in central Utah, a place called Monroe Mountain that got a little out of control. But you see this hotter burn in the center top. You see some completely eliminated forest where there was more conifer, hotter burn. You see mosaics where some trees are alive, and you see this area of aspen in the center where there was no effect. And so there's a whole kind of patch dynamic of heat, you might say, in this. And this is a cirral aspen forest. This is your conventional aspen ecology where there's a disturbance of mixed variety, and then over time aspen comes in prolifically and replaces that. Well, it's fire loving except where it isn't. That doesn't explain all of aspen ecology. Almost 100 years ago, Frederick Baker talked about 2 races of aspen, and we've neglected this in our management. But there's this other aspen called stable aspen, sometimes persistent aspen, where it's not fire prone at all. And aspen not burning well, except in very precise conditions, tends to be sort of an asbestos forest. But we forget that aspect of it. So the take-home message, if you get nothing else from this presentation, is that all aspen are not alike, and it's important to understand the ecology if we're going to effectively manage under today's natural resource management, which is really about emulating natural processes. So all aspen are not alike, and managing for process, not necessarily for composition, are 2 important messages. What is a clone exactly? On the left is the famed aspen clone. On the right is an adjacent clone. The line there, sort of 2-dimensional, extends underground purposely because there's a vast supporting root system. But basically, this is asexual reproduction where one tree sprouts from the roots of another, and over time, it creates a forest. It's thought that this forest, this Pando clone, has been around for a very long time, although we have virtually no idea of its age, contrary to what you will find on the internet. However, it's important to understand that there's a lot going on underground, that clones are genetically different, that clonal makeup, the genetic makeup, controls a lot of aspects of aspen ecology, including insect defense, herbivore defense, susceptibility to other diseases, perhaps, that come along, growth rates, color of leaves, timing of leaves on and off, and on down the line. So genetics is really critical, and it's all kind of tipped off by a clonal. But we have vegetative reproduction on the left, and we have reproduction by seed, which I'm going to come to in a minute. And so that we need to be aware that the one on the right over here is a brand new genotype, and it's not going to behave, at least initially, like the one on the left. And we need to adjust our ecological thinking around that. Let's get this idea of this. This is just a cirral aspen, sort of a hypothetical. And time 0 over here on the left, you have some kind of disturbance, let's say a big fire. An aspen takes an early lead, the yellow line, and it dominates for, my lines are off here. I'm sorry about the scale. It should be about 50 years, 60 years in here, and 100 years down here. So I apologize, something happened with my scaling there. But over time, conifers will come in. This is our classic traditional cirral aspen ecology. What I want you to really take a focus at is this dotted line, which is the dependent species, probably from tens to over 100 species that are dependent on this system, both plants and animals. And they're going to follow the trajectory of aspen. So be aware of that all the way through. And as Sarah had mentioned earlier, I'll occasionally have these references or citations, and you can click on the links to those, I believe, in the chat box. And if you miss anything, or if you have any questions about something I said, and whether it's supported by science, I will make sure you get that information in your hands by connecting with me. That's kind of what we do. So just a visual on this. Time 0, this is our classic succession. This is about 20 years down the line, about 60, 80 years, and perhaps 100 years or more, where just a few remaining aspen are in the system. Again, the conventional thought was that this is going to die out and aspen will go away, but our more recent science is telling us these 2 or 3 species on an acre can hang around sometimes for hundreds of years. So don't count them out. And they recall they have a supporting root system that's packed and ready for action if a disturbance comes along. So some of those biodiversity images, a big kitty cat scratching post, emphasis on large kitty cat, mountain lion. Some of that symbolized in the columbine, the state flower of Colorado, that plant diversity. And my favorite characters out on the scene, the sort of microflora, the arborific lichens and the lichen community is diversified by aspen presence. And that's shown in a study I did about 15 years ago. Basically, these different bars are different successional periods, from 1 being almost no conifers to 4 being dominated by conifers. And we have these little circles are those species that were statistically significant in favoring those different habitat niches. So project that across a large landscape, and a mosaic gives us diversity. And again, just in a cirral aspen system, we haven't dove deep into the stable systems yet. Pregnant pause. Well, thank you for playing our game, and now back to our regularly scheduled program. So here's a look at aspen sort of across North America. First of all, the most widespread tree species on the continent, basically Atlantic to Pacific and boreal to central, that way down here in central Mexico. But what I want to emphasize is these different functional types, because that's going to be really important in how we manage aspen systems appropriately. To take a closer look at this is sort of this kind of a decision tree, you might say. The stable and the cirral I've already outlined, and then these different subtypes. We're not going to have time to go into them. This is a whole separate 1-hour talk, but I just wanted to kind of give you a visual image of what that might look like. So you'll notice in the top panel, there's very much structural diversity, but single species in the tree overstory. And that behaves ecologically and therefore responds in terms of field stewardship or practice. Then this bottom one, which is the conventional or traditional aspen ecology of the cirral type, and where you have that kind of ecological succession over time and disruptions through disturbance. So on top, kind of a gap phase disturbance. It's more similar to eastern United States and eastern Canadian forests, where you have individual and small pockets of trees die out, which are very important. I don't want to belittle that. And in this bottom frame, that more that sort of stand replacing type disturbances, avalanches, fires, big insect and disease die-offs, and so on. Such as this. So fire, let's take a little bit of deeper dive into fire ecology of aspen. It's very reliant, as I said early, on fire in the cirral type, but not in the stable type. So in developing this, we published a paper about 7-8 years ago in Forest Ecology about these different forest aspen fire types. And basically, we have a continuum from the lower left in this diagram with low annual probability of fire and low mean severity and almost no fire at all into those stable aspen systems, and then a variety of different fire types depending somewhat on elevation as well as accompanying conifer species. And that, of course, influences fire severity and probability through time. But understanding those is the foundation of what I'm trying to communicate here, influences how we manage more ecologically or process-based systems. So what if we look way back in time, hundreds, even thousands of years, with this technique that I'm just getting involved in? All these people in the frame here are colleagues of mine from Mendel University and Charles University in the Czech Republic, who are implementing pedoanthropology, pedo being soil layers and anthra being ancient charcoals. And they look something like this at a microscopic level, and they can tell us the species with carbon dating, the time or age of this, and also with the sequence of these in layers, sort of how they fit in. So what's the amount of disturbance, what species were prevalent at this particular location, again in the Pando aspen clone. This is a ... to be continued story. However, we know that in times of high fire and dry climate in the ancient past, we had a lot of aspen stuff going on here, even in systems that were not particularly fire prone. And that seems to take place across the western and northern range of aspen forests. So I got to talk about that rare thing. And I put that in quotes because I'm saying that facetiously at this point in time. But just 10 to 20 years ago, we talked about true aspen seedlings as being a rare event. You'll note the citation down there, a really nice review by my colleagues Simon Landhauser, Brad Pino, and Karen Mock about the proliferation, actually, are finally developing an eye for finding what was always there, of true aspen seedlings, so a new genotype, and the events that sort of tip them off. This is my informal and very incomplete tally of more recent events where we've noted aspen seedlings coming in. You'll notice the Yellowstone fires, pretty famous cases there, but I wanted to kind of single out this one here because it's very interesting in the climate framework. This was a clear cut, not a fire, at an elevation approximately 200 meters above where aspen exists in Alberta. Lo and behold, some aspen seedlings came in there and were documented in this paper by Simon Landhauser of the University of Alberta and his colleagues. So very interesting. I bet your wheels are turning already about how that might happen in a changing climate. Excuse me. Herbivores, again, a whole nother topic in which I've spent a lot of time and done several publications in the recent 10 years or so, but as real drivers of these systems. And I want to be very clear that I mean there's appropriate levels of herbivores, there's inappropriate levels, and those would be either zero or too many. So I'm not opposed to herbivores in any way, shape, or form. However, the overabundance of them, as you well know, in the eastern US, and we are quickly finding out in the western US, cause big problems and sometimes even ecosystem collapse. So if I were talking to, well, whoever I'm talking to, I would say, let's take a pause here and say, is this a forest? I often present this to high school kids or elementary school kids, and of course your first reaction, there's trees in there, it's a forest. To my eye, it probably looks more similar to a community park or a cemetery, but there's some critical functions, some critical processes missing there, and I think you know where I'm going with this. It's this repeat browsing of aspen suckers. The system seems to be largely driven by asexual reproduction, even though I just mentioned the more and more discovery of the sexually reproducing from seed aspen. And I should have mentioned in that last slide, we barely have an infancy of that science taking off. We don't know the ecological role, for the most part, at any scale of what the seedlings are doing and how they fit into the big picture. But the suckers continually being browsed, they start to get bushy, the tops are eaten off year after year, decade after decade, and eventually you would know from your demographics that if you have a whole community of elderly trees, that's going to die out, just like if it was a human community of all elderly citizens. Lisa, I'm going to cue you up on this. I'm sorry, Sarah, on this short video. This is a motion censored video. I'll kind of set it up as she gets it going there. Again, from Monroe Mountain. It's a large plateau on the Colorado Plateau in south central Utah. And let's hope this takes off. So I want you to think about what's happening in the present moment and what's happened over time with this slide. Obviously, these are Rocky Mountain elk. This is the same as what is known as red deer in Europe. And it's a very big deer. And I don't mean that. Could you play that once more? Thanks. So you see, obviously, they're attracted to these short aspen that have become very bushy. But I want you to see the lack of those middle height, those sapling size aspen, and the proliferation of the young conifers. So probably accelerating forest succession here, and we can move on from that then. But these elk, as I said, in some areas appear to be overabundant, and also not just their population numbers, but their movement. Those two key elements are processes that we often neglect in our wildlife management. And as we try to connect with each other across disciplines, we need to do a much better job, in my opinion, of working between these fields. Okay, am I back to me? This is a civil environment. This is northern Arizona. And I want you to think in your mind now, I'm talking about mountain ranges, some that are mesas or plateaus. And this is a very large plateau that runs all the way across northern Arizona called the Mogollon Rim. I think it has some other names as well. Several national forests across northern Arizona, and it's relatively flat on the upper elevations. Of course, there's hills and mountain peaks, but it's a threshold, a physiographic threshold. And it looks a lot like this. Again, notice the absence of the what I would call the babies, the teenagers, and the young adults. They're all gone. So this is a system in terms of the aspen, which is headed, it's in a very precarious position. I want to talk about trophic cascades in a different context than you've heard about it in Yellowstone. So looking at the issue of climate change, a warming climate means less snow, but it means snow for a shorter season. Here, we've had snowpack on top of this Mogollon Rim, somewhere in the vicinity of 8,000 to 9,000 feet. I think that's 2,500 to 3,000, 3,500 meters, somewhere in that general range. Fairly high elevation for that part of the world, but the snow season has shortened over time. And if you think about drawing sort of a flat top mountain versus a pyramid mountain, there's a physiographic threshold that is a climate threshold, that is a snow threshold, that's an ecological threshold. So once I get to that flat top, now elk can access that area that had excessive snow for them to move around maybe 2 months, maybe 3 months, maybe 12 months. I'm sorry, they can access that 2 or 3 months that they used to not be able to, and maybe even year round. And so that has a big impact on the understory, that structural diversity that's so important in aspen communities. And so the elk moving through the snow seasonally, the season is expanded, which is affecting bird diversity. And I just love this work by Thomas Martin and Jon Meron that was in the journal Nature Climate Change a few years back, sort of connecting these dots with a really sound study. Let's look at that that we're used to looking at climate in terms of modeling and future projections. This is a map of the US. The top map shows average temperature. That's, in my mind, pretty well nailed down in terms of climate science. Precipitation is a little more difficult to monitor. In my part of the world, northern Utah, it's pretty imperfect. It kind of jumps around quite a bit. Wetter or drier, what is the big trend going to be? But this work came out about 8-10 years ago, and this is a classic climate envelope. You move through time, and aspen habitat shrinks from, this is I think it's 2010, 2030, and 2090, if I recall right, and you just have a shrinking envelope. You just take that, remember, our standard pyramid-shaped mountain, and you move the temperature uphill, and the area gets smaller. That's pretty easy. So that's kind of a nice first shot at what climate will do with aspen in the future. Unfortunately, or maybe realistically, there's a complication, and it's nearly the opposite, that this increased drought will contribute to increased fires, which is a great opportunity not only for aspen reignition in terms of sexual reproduction, but new aspen habitat in terms of seed production. I meant asexual versus the sprouting from the roots in this photo here versus the seedlings. All of those things, this is a great opportunity. So these folks here did a modeling exercise from northern Nevada, looking at combining what they've done here with disturbance and taking a little bit of look at the important element of aspen functional types, how they would react differently to climate change and fire. Another big issue. So we're kind of progressing through this, these different developments that have gone on here. what I'm calling borderlands, many people call borderlands, these boundaries between state and private and federal forests that constitute now ecological boundaries. And let me unpack that. Oddly enough, fires are not going to recognize boundaries. This is a slide from a very hot fire in Alaska. And the Thomas residents really wanted the fire to not come across the border there. You know, we're all about private land ownership, but the fires don't respect that. Animals don't respect those things. And different things sometimes happen on different sides of the border, depending on what we do as land managers and how we collaborate, communicate, and link up with those on the other side of the fence, so to speak. So this brings us to the refuge effect. And now I'm talking specifically about herbivory from deer, elk, cattle, and sheep. But these fences, these exclosures, in this case, somebody's property line, no aspen on this side, the forest is essentially gone or has no future, versus a lot of aspen on this side. This is private land. They put up their own fence, happens to be the same ownership. But basically, in this large, huge private land owning in southern Colorado, they will not have a forest unless they put up fences. And I think most of us want to visit forests without fences if possible. However, this gets us to this idea of habitat compression or compaction, in which what we decide to do on one side versus the other has huge ramifications for the ecology that follows. And actually, I believe what we want is not either side of the fence, 100% browsing or zero browsing, but something that's moderate, and that's a difficult human problem to tackle. This is just a fun slide from from Gardner, Montana, right on the edge of Yellowstone National Park, which we know has their own elk issues, but somebody really wanted to highlight that as a commercial endeavor. So private land property, a study that was in Natural Areas Journal a few years back, looking at this in the context of private land ownership. I'm going to cut to the chase, present one of my big 2 data slides. So I'm super thrilled right now to show you some data. But basically on the left side of this dotted line approximates about half of our field locations across a 15,000 acre area. We have an unsustainable case. We have not enough recruitment because of browsing to support aspen regeneration, resilience, sustainability. Luckily on this landscape, I've worked in some that are much more severe. We have a variety of areas that had pretty good results, but still these private landowners are pretty concerned. And to cut to the chase here, they're surrounded by Forest Service land. On federal lands, we have, on many federal lands, not all, we have hunting season. The animals know when hunting season starts, and that's not a joke. And they come across the boundary and they live on this private land. So they have an inordinate amount of large herbivores, which the first few years of land ownership was pretty cool to have an elk in your driveway. But after they eat all your shrubs and all the trees and all your future aspen forests, it's a little different story. And don't forget all of those dependent species that go along with that. Okay, we're going to cut that one a little short. We're a little short on time, so I apologize. I want to move on to the adaptive cycle here, this idea of what we do on the ground. What do we do for effective stewardship? And you'll see really quickly this could apply to a lot of systems, but I've done a lot of work in aspen systems and a lot of workshops involving a lot of help from others, by the way, in tackling this issue. But we try to put all those things I just covered, a whole complex basket full of issues, and to look at the interactive effects of them and how do we go about that systematically so that we're effective land stewards. This is a complicated analysis, my last and final data set here, but if you're familiar with ordinations, or even if you're not, this is called non-metric multidimensional scaling, a huge mouthful. But this is our most recent paper from the Pando clone in central Utah. But basically the data itself creates a statistical landscape. We have these divisions here of 2013 fencing, no fencing, and 2014 fencing. We have a lot of history and different land use at this place, recreational use, a road going through it, all kinds of issues here. But you'll notice a clustering or separation out of the 2013 fence. Almost no clustering or these are very similar, these other two fence zones. But what I want you to focus on is how we tried to look at many different issues in one statistical package, a very powerful statistical tool in which different types of data can all be put into one sort of statistical machine, you might say, to look at dimensions of this ecological issue. But basically, we have a clear signal that deer scat, as our surrogate for deer and cattle presence, runs in opposition to successful regeneration. Our recruitment is too young there to give us a good signal, but we have this other transect of kind of canopy cover or total aspen trees per hectare, or live trees per hectare, and canopy shading versus Simpson's diversity. So the more our canopy is broken up, the greater diversity we have. The denser older stands have less diversity. And remember, I said this Pando clone is very threatened by our current actions which is a combination of several of these items on the right. So this is all driven by monitoring. So a third key message of this entire presentation is to understand monitoring. I'm going to go very quickly through a recap of these aspen functional types. On the right, the stable type; on the left, the serial type, kind of interacting with species dynamics on the serial type versus structural dynamics. When we take away the structural dynamics, if you look up here, you'll see a single layer with no understory, very threatened aspen forest. Here is a forest that could be rejuvenated potentially by some disturbance. This less so. These forests are much more threatened in the Western US from our current management and wildlife practices. And so again, a reference to this functional types work. We're coming down to the practical, the brass tacks. This, again, very logical stuff. You've seen it in different forms, but it puts it all in one package. In this field guide, it's a little pocket size or backpack size field guide that we have in hard copy. It's also available on our website for download, but it's a guide to quaking aspen management. And this just gives you a practical plan, a practical approach, but you'll see that it's cross-disciplinary, it's cross-agency. We're working with others. We're deciding what type it is. We're trying to understand the causes before we start working with the system by consulting our experts, by putting in some preliminary monitoring plots, by checking the literature, which the Western Aspen Alliance tries to help you out with. We come up with a plan, we implement it, but the key to all of this is that our monitoring influences what we do in the future. This stands in stark opposition to that 1965 picture and less aggressive tactics in which I, the manager 20 years ago, did something, I knew I was right, I walked away, assumed I was right, and never came back because I'm the guy who's always right, right? Well, we know that doesn't work. We know that's wrong, and usually maybe I retired and walked out the door by then. So this gives you a concrete plan. It infuses monitoring as the centerpiece of all this, instead of it being a lesser priority. So different restoration approaches quickly put up barriers, in this case using on-site materials to stack up a fence to eliminate herbivory. This could be after a fire and salvage cut. It could be harvesting some trees for commercial purposes, or it could be just for aspen preservation because we have a bad system. I'm going to go back one here because this is really important. This is a fire that took place over 20 years ago of 10,000 acres in southern Colorado. This is an ecological catastrophe. When we got out of our vehicles, we could smell large herbivores, predominantly elk, that have flocked to the private lands as a safe haven. They're even eating conifers, and there's nothing growing back there, and very little you'll see understory diversity either. Just to the left of the screen is a small exclosure full of little baby aspen. They have to basically fence them out. So just to be clear, I'm not advocating that building a wall is the solution to all of our problems. It just gives us a hint at what might grow otherwise. So we can put up barriers. but I'm obviously recommending this adaptive approach. This is a small fire in southeastern Wyoming. We had some growth coming back, very healthy. We had some strained trees. The way this tree is growing tells me there's probably really shallow soils, so it's not a really fast-growing environment, but every single one of these sprouts was browsed. So the group sitting around is developing another plan based on our quick monitoring action there. Some other options: we can use fire, we can use selective cutting. This has no fencing at all, but they come back and they monitor every year in southern Montana. Here in the lower left is a fence with no bottom to it, about a half-meter gap. We have aspen growth there. We have a sapling inside. We have a very successful fence that doesn't cut off all animal flow, just those larger ungulates that are doing the browsing. And then here's kind of an innovative approach from the Black Hills, where it's called hinging, where we cut the stumps high from some aspen trees, some conifer trees, and we leave the tree on the stump to kind of create these hodgepodge of fencing throughout the site. So different approaches, but they're all contingent upon follow-up monitoring. This is us back in Yellowstone on the solstice day, monitoring some of these plots that have been permanent plots for 20 years or so. But some barriers to monitoring, and I think we're all familiar with these, and I'm imploring you to go back and reevaluate how we prioritize or don't monitoring. I've already alluded to false assumptions of being right and not monitoring at all. Money, time, and people often favors other aspects of your field work than monitoring. Agency priorities or directives often do the same. We don't do the right monitoring, or we have insufficient data, and then we have loss of institutional data. This is when old Bart leaves the office and has a file full of his monitoring plots and an aspen treatment from 30 years ago, and they threw them out or they were never digitized. All in all, we can do better. This is Southwest Wyoming. This is called a ghost forest. It's not coming back. There's a myth that somehow the roots are living underground without photosynthesis above ground. I think everybody knows what a myth is. Again, in the interest of time, I'm going to move on past the tumultuous relationship between Megan and Jon. But those will be posted, I should have said earlier, on our Facebook page just after I get off this, if you want to re-look at those instigating photos. So I'm going to kind of wrap it up here. And I'm borrowing heavily from my partners and what I call the Beaver team here at Utah State University. And you notice they borrowed a logo from a prominent product, but you'll notice the change in wording. And I couldn't agree with them more. The inefficient forest is taken from their inefficient stream, and process-based restoration. We focused, in my opinion, overly long on species composition when emulating and practicing process-based restoration will take us a lot farther. A straight stream gets a lot of sediment downhill and a lot of water downhill fast, but does little or nothing for the environment and over time degrades it. Introduction of beaver, this is a very healthy beaver colony here in northern Utah where I live, widens the stream, spreads the water out. The beaver, you might say, harvest the mature aspen trees at different levels over time. So you'll see a very patchy dynamic in aspen here. And the beaver are going much further than the old textbook set of 100 feet, up to 200 meters away, way up this slope, dragging mature trees down, limbing them. That's how they get these smaller branches. So they're not eating the babies that the other herbivores are. They're taking apart trees. They're making this very complex ecosystem it's highly diverse, not only in the birds, not only in the mammals, but the plants and even the fish species. A very healthy and diverse system, I'm going to say, depends on inefficiency, and at least in our narrow historical management terms that we've been working with for decades now. So, to sharing is caring. How do we put all this together? Putting the community back in ecology, and I mean that in the broadest sense. Cross-agency, interdisciplinary, transboundary. let's get on board with sharing information instead of, in my academic world, people often hoard information, or they hoard knowledge, or they pause until it's officially produced or published. And then it reaches a small audience, to be quite frank. How do we get away from that model and be more fluid? Same with our disciplines. Wildlife people talking to vegetation specialists or forestry. I'm running into a lot the differences between state and federal agencies. The state agencies typically have a agricultural model when it's harvest the water, fish, trees, wildlife for short-term benefits. And the federal managers often have an ecosystem or long-term or resilience-based approach. These need to become more compatible, more sharing, same across public and private boundaries. I'm going to bring us all the way back to that big global picture and this concept of mega conservation. The idea of this is to flip traditional conservation, narrow, single species based. Think of your favorite world iconic species that's on a stamp. And we go after that with millions of dollars to conserve that narrow niche. I am not by any means suggesting throwing that out. What I'm talking about here is looking at common species. In this, by the way, this is a cool global orthographic projection of the Earth, looking at the near handshake across this Bering Strait of the two big aspen systems and lesser aspen systems around the world. But common species that are degraded, that support huge amounts of biodiversity. Isn't this another viable conservation approach that may have more bang for the buck? Just something to think about. Finally, the Western Aspen Alliance. Knowing the way, here's some of the stuff we do. This is user-based. We're spread out quite a bit between disciplines, from citizens to scientists, to across many agencies, federal, state, and so on. You can find us on the web there. I've got to move along here, and I apologize for going a little over time. But we do all of these services. I'm happy to have you join in our free membership. Again, we're a nonprofit associated with Utah State University, and it'd be great to have you interact with us or use these services. Go to the website and download materials as you see fit. With that in mind, I want to thank you very much for your time and attention on this broad sweeping presentation, and place my contact information there, along with, if you're really interested in kind of cool and artsy forest and barkscape focused photography, check out Lance Odet's work at Studio 4760 North, and I thank you so much.
So Paul, earlier in the presentation, Adrian was asking about a clarifying question about the two races of aspen, in particular, whether they coexist in the same area or whether they're occurring in different environments.
Great question. I think the one slide I showed a little later, just a different aspect, north facing versus south facing, and the same landscape. So they can often be quite adjacent to each other, and other times they're completely separate from each other. So they can sort of be both. Great question. I appreciate that.
Okay. And then Mark asked, what are the primary abiotic factors that determine where aspen live? Is it elevation, rainfall, soils? He notes that in northern Idaho, there's very little aspen, 5,000 to 6,000 feet. I'm assuming that's above sea level, where it's wet. He's thinking that it might be too conducive to competing conifer growth.
Well, I think he's right there, that last statement at least. But yes, I think he's dead on. It's going to be a combination of factors like so many things, but soil and moisture retention in the soil. And by the way, aspen, if you can imagine a single hardwood in a conifer landscape, the longer it's there, the more it's going to create its own soil, so to speak. So these mollisoils that are richer because of the deciduous nature of that species can put more organic matter in there and create that over time. However, new systems getting started, it helps to have, we talked about that seedling coming into new environments, particularly under a changing climate, clearing that, having a lot of carbon in the soil, having a lot of moisture at the right time could potentially be fertile for new aspen colonies or clones. So a lot to look at there, but I think he's already on the right track in terms of soil and moisture availability being key elements.
Okay, great, thank you. Just circling back to this question of the two races of aspen, are they genetically or physiologically different?
Well, they're certainly genetically different, but you can, say, in a stable community or a serial community, you can have adjacent clones. And a clone, let's be clear here, generally in the West, they tend to be larger in size, but that's only a rule of thumb. In the East or in the Western places, they could be anywhere from one tree to, in this case, 47,000 estimated trees in the Pando clone. They can range vastly in size. And so that can be on the same landscape within the same forest, adjacent to each other, sometimes slightly intermixed on the same landscape. So they're the two races, and keep in mind, that's a very old-fashioned term, but it was just interesting to note that somebody talked about that 100 years ago.
Okay. Circling back to the occurrence question, is there work to delineate aspen stands based on soil characteristics, as in wetland work where you can tell where the historic meadow existed based on soil color, et cetera? This is from Devin.
Hey, Devin, thanks for that question. The shorter answer is, and I like to point out the strengths as well as the weaknesses in aspen ecology research. And our hydrology work, our water retention, and our soils work it's a big weakness in this field. There have been some studies, really more review type studies in the past, but nothing that I feel satisfied as an ecologist that we've really probed that topic in depth. So yeah, we know soils play a big role here, but we also know that we're woefully short in terms of exploring the depths, pun intended, of that topic.
Following up on that, Robin asks, do we know if aspen is associated with mycorrhizae, and if so, do we know the species?
Yes to the first one. I don't know this. I bet somebody does. Again, I'm going to be honest with you, but I could hopefully help you find that answer if we really wanted to dive deeper on that. But I don't know the species. They certainly are associated with mycorrhizae. Okay,
great. So Robin, feel free to reach out to Paul. I've shared his contact information in the chat.
And it's on our screen right there as well.
Yep. There was another, here's Eric. Could restoration of clones like Pando potentially recruit seedlings that might replace the Pando genotype from within the stand?
Okay, so no. And basically that's physiologically impossible that it would recruit seedlings. And I'm understanding you to mean in a strict sense of a seedling is going to be a new genotype. However, restoration, the key there, and again, this is a whole nother talk, which I've done in other venues, but the Pando clone, the key to rescuing that is trying to understand and manage effectively that herbivory situation, which is basically causing that whole system to collapse. And so asexual regeneration from the roots is going to be how we're going to proliferate the clone to keep the same genetic type alive, versus seedlings coming in there would start new clones, if that makes any sense to you. So I guess you could back up and say, how sacred is that specific clone versus a new genotype? And a lot of people think that there's a lot of value in understanding and studying that giant clone for its ramifications to other clonal situations around the world.
So here's another aspen reproduction question from Sarah. She says that the grove near her family's cabin in the Uintas, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that, have begun to great, have begun to flower and fruit extensively when they hadn't done so noticeably before. And she's curious if that's indicative of anything when an aspen grove suddenly starts flowering and fruiting.
There's this idea, again, perhaps a myth or perhaps just underexplored, that they'll flower and fruit and send out seeds it's sort of after big fire or disturbance events. I would tend to poo-poo that, but there's just weak science to back that up. However, there's some periodicity to when they flower and fruit. And I think it's very difficult to predict, quite frankly. So I have a poor answer for you. I'm sorry. I don't really know that specific reasoning for why that is flowering at this time. And it could be related to, we had a wetter winter this past year, and it could be related to available resources, more moisture in the soil.
Okay. We're going to turn to a handful of wildlife questions that we've had coming in. Um, I, I think I'm looking at an email address and not an actual name here, but the attendee says, thanks, Paul and NAA. Wondering if there's been much research in your Eurasian systems that reflect the wildlife species diversity using the Western U.S. aspen stand. So is diversity a global, aspen diversity a global phenomenon?
Yes, and I would say it's at different levels in different areas. More in China, they've done some quite a bit of research on, I think it's more plant diversity, but some faunal diversity as well. Very much less so across Russia, Siberian part of Asia. That's my knowledge of it thus far, and some of that is captured in a shallow way in that world paper. So I advise you to take a look at that. But again, another call for more to do there.
Okay. Luke asks, aspen management treatment for resiliency restoration versus leaving it be in a declining stand where climate change may also be a factor in regeneration success, excluding impacts from herbivory. He's asking, what are your thoughts and what are some considerations?
Great question. There's many angles to that. And I know you don't want to hear about herbivory. Maybe I overplayed that, but it's so critical, at least in our area and actually into southern Canada as well. So monitor first, find out if you can determine what the cause or what the issue is. Just walking through and saying this aspen stand is X, Y, or Z, in my opinion, is insufficient. Getting some preliminary data. Maybe you find out immediately you have no herbivory issue, and that gives you more flexibility in terms of what you might do silviculturally in terms of managing vegetation, perhaps doing nothing, perhaps using some prescribed fire. But it's sort of understanding the landscape, understanding the ecology, what is the forest functional type. Is it expected to reproduce prolifically? Case in point, if it's a stable type, I don't advise clear fell coppicing. That does not emulate natural processes at all. And if you have an herbivory problem, you might just have put all of your chips on the table for a single bet and it didn't come up well. That's a very risky strategy, but we've done that a lot in the past. So I could go on for that question for a long time, but there's a couple scenarios to think about. But managing for resilience is having some level of reproduction and recruitment. And I distinguish those between the reproduction being the tinier babies and the recruitment being the ones that have grown beyond browsing level. Having some level of those, even in cereal stands, is quite important in my estimation.
Okay. There are a couple questions about predators. You noted, Paul, in your presentation that wolves have been reintroduced in some places and are making a comeback. Paula asks, does the introduction of an apex predator help balance the system for aspen? Has that been documented?
Again, more complex than you'd think, but I'll give you my take on this. And I've read quite a bit of the literature, and I'm now involved in a PhD research program going on there, trying to answer this question. But basically, I alluded to numbers and movement. So what are the numbers and movement of your prime and maybe secondary and tertiary herbivores? Are there a lot of them? Is there a quote unquote overpopulation that's browsing everything? And I didn't even get into the whole field of chemical defense, which is super cool. But are there too many of them? And then how often are they moving? The apex predators have certainly had an impact, in my estimation, on reducing the numbers, probably along with some changes in hunting and other things in the Yellowstone ecosystem. But the movement, the so-called geography of fear, is more disputed in the academic world. However, there's probably some factor there. If you can imagine 50 animals sitting in one place for 3 or 4 weeks eating everything versus those that have to migrate somewhat or move a little bit, there's probably some level of impact there, but the literature is starting to go the other way on that angle. So yes, positive impact. The degree to which it's influenced by direct predation versus the scare of the landscape is still being investigated quite a bit.
Okay. Margaret asks, do you anticipate oyster shell scale, OSS, will impact trembling aspen regeneration in the Southwest? It seems many factors, drought, herbivory, and now OSS, are lining up against aspen regeneration.
Hi, Margaret. Margaret's kind of a ringer and one of my friends, but she's a faculty member at MAU. I believe it's the same Margaret. Anyways, the short answer again, yes, this is fairly new to me. The folks at her university have been looking at it for a few years, but like any invasive species, sort of like one that's in our environment now sociologically and epidemiologically, we know so little. We're kind of poking in the dark. And so certainly the sites I went to last fall, it's affecting regeneration. This is a small invasive species, relatively new to aspen, at least in the Southwest. I'd seen it in the upper Midwest prior to that. But it definitely affects as a primary pathogen. And then aspen, like many tree species, usually dies of several things and not a single thing, but it certainly weakens the tree. And it seems to be having, based on my qualitative observation, some serious impact. But we're getting some things underway to get that in a little bit more measured fashion to try to understand that. But the train's way out ahead of the passengers right now, is my look at that issue. And basically, we're trying to get a handle on it. First of all, the very basics. Where is it? We found it in Nevada last year. We didn't know it was there. And what's its physiological impact? First of all, on regeneration and recruitment. To me, if I had to bet all my my limited resource and monitoring dollars, I would put money at looking at those things first, and not so much the death of mature trees. That happens all the time in aspen. It's what happens next. And you can quote me on that for other types of forest as well.
Sure. So following up on something that you just alluded to here in the Q&A, Paul, Jesse is asking, what role do glycosides and tannins in aspen play in reducing herbivory, and how does this interact with fire severity?
One of my favorite topics, but super cool. I would refer you to the laboratory of Richard Lindroth at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He's my guru on this, but I've tried to read as much of his work as possible. I lightly referred to this, and basically based on genetics, you'll have different levels of defense in phenolic glycosides and tannins. Those two different elements, chemicals, tend to defend against different creatures. Grossly speaking, insect herbivores versus mammalian herbivores. And so they're kind of differently invested based on age or ontology. So more in tannins in older trees, more in phenolic glycosides in younger trees to ward off to make the leaves taste bad and the stems taste bad, to put it in simple terms, and make the animals not want to eat them. However, and this is very critical, all bets are off if there are too many animals for a system. They'll eat what's there if they're hungry. So chemical ecology is not the be-all, end-all, but it certainly has interesting and fascinating, wonderful things to think about in terms of impacts on the total ecology of these systems. So I encourage you to look into the work of Rick Lindroth and his students. It's really cool stuff, and I can help you find that if you like.
That sounds great. Thank you. Brad asked, as it relates to aspen ecology, what are specific pitfalls to composition-based management as opposed to process-based management?
Great question. So I guess my gripe with our traditional composition-based management is if we focus so much on how many trees are on there per acre or how many animals, so pick your species, we lose track of the processes. These systems, the trees fluctuate through time. The species A flowering plant or species A apex predator moves around on the landscape. All these things are in great flux. And so immediately that makes me think of process and the importance of process. And so counting them one or even several points in time, I feel really limits our options in terms of our adaptive monitoring approach. We want to know that there's some reproduction. We don't scream the sky is falling if there's little reproduction and we don't have enough of this say some key or threatened plant species. What we want to do is follow that through time and try to reintroduce to the best of our ability. And we know in our highly human influenced systems, there's a lot of human factors to consider. So I don't want you to presume that this is simple, but we need to take those considerations as we try to emulate processes. We're not going to nail them. We're not going to reconstruct environments, But our best stewardship strategy to date, or at this time, seems to be emulation of natural process, whether it's in silviculture or wildlife management or watershed management or soil management. How do we get those processes on track to really do resilience management instead of just, if I go out and put 53 aspen trees and 2 wolves and 47 of this, does that mean that they're going to stay on the ground? That seems like a different and more difficult bargain from my perspective.
Okay. Molly asks, I'm curious about your thoughts on controlling herbivores as a potentially major threat to aspen ecosystems. You did a great job of discussing the nuances with management using fencing, hunting, and predators. What is your vision for management action that combats the herbivores in nuanced and impactful ways?
Oh, wonderful question. I appreciate that. Well, first of all, the nuance is a key element there. And what I mean is geographically nuanced. I cannot sit here and prescribe something that's going to sweep across all of these issues, east or west, north or south on this continent. However, understanding that situation first, as I sort of alluded to in an earlier question, what's the results of your monitoring? What are the chief factors as far as you can tell? And then monitoring and adapting as you go. So that's kind of the framework. Now, specific to herbivores, this is where we get into the people part of stuff really quickly. We have people who are going to talk about their culture and their history ranching cattle. We have people who are going to talk about the need to have not just moderate or fluctuating populations of game species, but actually near maximum populations to improve game success, which is tied to economics and hunting licenses. Wow, we get into complex, cross-agency, really difficult issues. So if we can work with those and work with those people from the different agencies in some way, trying to, let's say we have no apex predators in many parts of the Western states, how do we use hunting to emulate the practices of apex predators, or at least the numbers of herbivores on the ground? We know that systems are overstocked with certain herbivores if they've been around for hundreds, if not thousands of years, and they're suddenly failing, quoting the district ranger in the Pando situation, on our watch. Imagine to yourself a system that's been around for tens of thousands of years, perhaps, and it's coming unraveled because of what we've done now. So these situations, wildlife, silviculture, forest, recreation, when they go awry, the finger points firmly back at us, and it's incumbent upon us to use some of those cross-boundary, interdisciplinary, interagency solutions to get back to work and work across those difficult boundaries.
Well, Paul, I think that's a great note to leave it on. Thank you again for this presentation. Thank you for sticking with us for additional Q&A. I think that folks really enjoyed that. I certainly did. Thank you everyone who attended. We appreciate your time and your interest in the topic. Just want to put it out there one more time. Paul is organizing a symposium as part of the Natural Areas Conference coming up in October. Registration is opening for that this week for the conference, so you'll want to check our website, naturalareas.org, for more details on that, and we hope that you'll join us for that conference. Also, you'll want to check out Paul's organization, the Western Aspen Alliance. I've shared their website and their Facebook page in the chat section, so please do visit them, consider joining their organization as well. So once again, thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Paul. It was a great way to spend an hour and a half. Everybody have a great day.
Thanks, everyone. That was really fun.
All right, bye.